So thanks everybody for tuning in. Today I'm going to do a live demo of publications, both from the view of the user who wants to publish a file and from the view of a per team member who is on the admin end doing data curation and publication. Just to give you a little bit of context for that, our audience is really Purdue researchers, and that could be faculty, staff, or also students. And that can also be somebody from any department in the university. And that's actually really important to understand our services, is that they're intentionally flexible and generic enough that we can use them for pretty much anybody who's working at Purdue. So we have data that ranges from like text transcripts of philosophy lectures to genomics data, and we want to be able to serve kind of everybody on that spectrum. And data publication is a really key part of what we do, and that's what I'll talk about most today. But just to give you a little bit of how that fits into the spectrum of other services that we offer, we really strive to support our researchers throughout the whole data management lifecycle. Actually, if I click over to our Get Started page if you want to check that out, or peruse it on your own later. That has a little bit more information on some of the services that we provide. So we will take people through the data management lifecycle from the planning stage before they're actively doing their research. We offer resources to support data management planning and grant preparation. During the actual research process, we provide private file storage and sharing space on the web, which really helps facilitate collaborations between researchers in different departments of the university and also with people in other institutions or out in industry. Since PER is web-based, it provides a little more flexibility for collaboration that way. And once the research process is wrapping up, we offer data publication services, and this is in response to a need in the research community. So it's increasingly popular for funders to either recommend or require that their grantees publish and publicly share their data after the completion of their research. So we're responding to that need, and we expect that need to continue to trend upwards as more and more funders require that, and as the scientific community just starts to kind of get used to that culture shift and demands it as well. Now, once data sets are published with us, we also offer some post-publication services like archiving, and when we're talking about archiving, we're coming at this from a library's perspective. So PER is part of the library's research data unit, and we want to not only preserve the data itself, we want to preserve access to it. So it's something that people can find, access, and reuse. And then we also provide some impact tracking for our authors. So we can track how often our published data sets are being cited and who's citing them so that our authors can see the impact of their research. Okay, unless anybody has questions about kind of PER in general, I'm going to hop into the live demo now. And feel free to Claire to interrupt me if someone sends like a chat question that I can't see while I'm working here. So I am logged into PER right now, and I'm going to go up to my account to start from. So this is the dashboard that a user sees when they log in. All of our publications start as projects. That's where I'm going to start. So I'll show you how to use our project space to upload data files and how to submit those files for publication. And then also show you what that looks like on the other end when we're doing the data curation process of that submitted publication. So I'm going to navigate over to a test project of mine. And so this is what our project space looks like. And it is very focused on files. although we do have some other kind of project management tools available to folks, like an update feed, for example, here. But we're largely, most of our project users use the features of the file storage and sharing. So this is my personal project. I can have access to all of these files. I can also choose to share those with other people, but I don't have to. I can't just make it a personal file storage space. And you'll notice I have a bunch of test files in here from previous demos and such. And this kind of lets you know how agnostic this system is. We are not restricting the types of files that researchers can store here. It can pretty much be anything. And so instead of offering like interactive tools where they can do a lot with the data inside the website of PUR, it's much more of an upload-download system that allows us to accept any kind of data in any kind of format. So I'll show you how easy it is to get started with this publication process. I'm going to upload some data files. And if I can find what I'm looking for. There we go. These are real data files from a data set that's already been published on PUR and it's already publicly available. Okay, so now I've uploaded these files to PUR. You can see them here. And so the next step is to move over to our publications section. And I want to start a new publication. Our users get a choice of what kind of publication they want to start. Almost all of our publications are file formats, and that's what I'm going to demo. We also have the option to create some data tables that display within PUR and to group multiple publications together into a series. But I won't touch on those unless there's questions about them later. I'll just look at files. So this launches the publication submission process, and it's basically like a wizard that takes users through step by step, selecting what exactly they want to publish, and then adding kind of descriptive context and metadata to that. So from here, I'm going to start by adding the files that we previously uploaded to our project. And you'll notice I have the option of adding any and all of my files or only specific ones. So it allows you to keep much of your project private and selectively publish your finished results. Okay, these are the two files that I want to include. And these are, it's pretty typical of the kind of data we get. I'll show you what it looks like really quick. We have a data table file, and crucially, we also have a data dictionary spelling out what information is in that file, what the units of measurement are, what any abbreviations stand for, so that it's easily interpretable to anybody who's downloading this data. I'll go back over to our publication screen. So those are the two things I want to publish. And then we ask the author to submit some basic descriptive metadata about their data set. So we would want to give this publication a title. And I'm not going to type everything in here, but we'll just add some fuller text so you can see how it works. We ask our authors to provide a really short description of their data set that we can then use to display in search results as a preview of what the data set is about. we have a longer text field to provide more information, and this might be a place where an author could paste in information from an article abstract. If this data set is connected to a particular article, this would be an appropriate place to insert that kind of summary information just about the research in general. And we try to ask our authors to provide descriptive information that is about the data within the context of the research. So we don't want it to be titled, for example, like my data set or data set for this article. It makes more sense to talk about the actual content of the data. So, for example, these data files were coming from a title or an article about alfalfa our agriculture. So we ask the author to write description about that. We can also add authors. As the wizard here brings up any person who's a member of your project team, so anybody that has access to your project can be selected as an author. You can also add another author as well. This is really common with academic papers, that there are multiple authors, and they might not all be members of the project, so it's important to have an option for people to add that information outside of that. Let's add me. We also give authors the option to, if you have multiple authors, to reorder them according to whatever is the standard in your discipline. So the next step in our process is an extras page. And so this gives us the opportunity to upload image files we want to display on the per web page for this publication. We have the option to provide a link to an external website so that when someone clicks the option to download your data, an external site will also come up. This can be nice if the author is publishing a companion article that is free and openly available on the web for anyone to see without subscription. They can just have that website pop up to make it an easy companion with the accompanying data set. And then we have the option to also upload files in a separate section as supporting documents. So I uploaded my data dictionary in the first step here in the main content section, and it's pretty easy to tell which file is data and which file is the data dictionary because I've only got two. If you have, say, hundreds of files, this is a nice option. It allows you to segregate the data itself from the description of that data set just to make it easier for users to navigate. We provide licenses that our users can choose from a list. Our standard is a Creative Commons Universal License, and this kind of in plain English is saying that anyone can use this resource. It's publicly available. We won't restrict how you use it, but please cite it. That's our most common option. We also provide a lot of others for users that want to provide more restrictions on their data. And we do add and update this list depending on what our users request. So if there's an open source license out there that we're not connected to, we allow users to request that we add it to our list. And we've done that a few times in the past year. We also have some support materials that go into a little more detail about all of these licenses as well, so that a user who's not familiar with them can learn about which is the best option for them. Make sure I click the box that I agree to the license. And then the last bit of publication metadata that we're asking our users to provide here are some subject tags. So this is a really great place to get that subject expertise from the author themselves, to ask them to think about what key terms would they search if they wanted to find this data. In this case, I'm going to add the tag test, and you can see that when I type into this field here, a bunch of suggestions of existing tags comes up, just to help us keep our tag list kind of as streamlined as we can. So I mentioned earlier that we track where our data sets are being cited. It's also something that authors can enter themselves, and we made it part of the publication process because so many of our data sets are published in association with an article or another kind of publication. And so putting it within the publication process here makes it an easy way for add in a citation for the article that they're publishing along with this data set. Now, of course, they can also go back and add something later. And our team, when we find new citations of this data set, will go back and add new ones as well. But this allows for that initial link between this data set and whatever other publication it's connected to. And finally, we have the option to add some notes about this particular release. And so what's important to know here is that PER supports different versions of dataset publications, so that if I publish a dataset and then let's say like 6 months later, I go back through the data and refine it or correct an error or add another facet to it, I have the option to make those changes public as a version 2 of my data set. And so we might make some notes here about what's different about version 2 than version 1. And the nice thing about having publication versions is that you can see which version was published when. So if I publish a second version of a data set, that is the version that anyone would find when they're looking at my data set. But we could also see what version 1 was and when it was published, so that there's kind of a clear path of progression as the data set might change a little bit over time, but not change so significantly that it warrants a brand new publication. So my final page here as a user submitting a publication just shows me a review of what I just inputted. It's asking me for a little bit more information. I can set a publication date in the future if this data set is kind of under an embargo and I want to record it in PER but not make it publicly available just yet. I can do that. I can also designate from any of the authors who would be the main point of contact for anyone using this data set that they could reach out to. I can make a note to the administrator about this draft, and then of course I have to agree to our terms. And from there I can submit my publication draft. Now, it's not public yet, but PER provides me as the author an option to get a preview of what it will look like when it is published. So here you can see that descriptive data that we entered, my title, author. This is where our synopsis, our short 1 to 2 sentence description would be. We have where we would have a more lengthy description of the research. And then we also have right on the front page here with your data set, how this research can be cited. We really want to facilitate researchers citing data in new research that they're conducting. And one of the ways that we do that is not only by providing a handy copy and paste format that you can use to cite this, but we also provide a DOI, or a digital object identifier, to each of our published data sets. This is basically like a permanent link to this data set. Our authors can use them in personal websites that show their list of publications. They could submit this DOI as a citation to another paper that they write. And this is a unique identifier that will always lead back to this particular data set, even if this URL were to change. So it's more persistent than just a URL. This is also a good place to mention that PER will commit to our authors that we keep their data set published on the PER website for at least 10 years. After that time, it might shift to a library collection. But even at that point, if it were to shift out of the PER collection and into like a library collection, this DOI would still link the user to the data set itself. So that's really important. And then over here you can see this option to download bundle. This is where you would actually download the data files that I've published. And this is, again, intentionally generic so that we can accept any kind of file type that a researcher wants to publish in. Okay. So that's the process from the user's perspective. At this point, after they've submitted their publication, and you can see here this little alert box says this publication is pending approval by a site administrator. So at this point, the PER website sends an alert out to a member of the PER team to go in and review this publication and make it publicly available. Now, our process for that involves PER staff and then also a liaison librarian who works for the university that has subject matter knowledge in whatever subject this publication is a part of. And that's really important because a data curator on the PER end can review a data set for kind of completeness and that it's well described and that it is what it appears to be. But we aren't experts at everything. And so we do have a really good partnership with our liaison librarian so that, for example, if we have a civil engineer submit a data set for publication, I can alert the librarian for our civil engineering department, and then they have the option to review the data set before it's published as well. And we try to keep that review process down to a 2-day turnaround time between when someone submits a data set for publication and when it's actually freely publicly available on the PER website to anyone. So when a PER team member is alerted that there's a new publication waiting for approval, we can look at a list on the PER website of all of our pending publications. So if I refresh my screen, we should see mine pop up here. Yep. Okay. And so this is a screen that only the PER team member would be seeing. And it gives us some options for this data set that's pending approval. I can assign it to a curator. And so this is one way that I can communicate with our liaison librarians. By entering their username in here as a curator, I'm giving them access to this data set before it goes public. So they normally wouldn't be able to see just any data set that's pending approval. They'll have specific access to the data sets that they need to look at. And then in addition to assigning the data set, I also have a review screen that I can launch. I'll launch here in a second. And then a preview page where I can see what the publication page looks like. So this is usually where I'll start when I'm starting the curation process. And I'm going to be interested in testing not so much the subject of the data itself, but the completeness of the data set. So I'm going to be looking for things like a synopsis and a description that are a lot more informative than these sample ones that I've provided here. And, you know, there is some value in having someone who doesn't have subject expertise do this kind of vetting. And that's because, we don't know for sure how this data could be used in the future. We don't want to limit it only to people who have a very deep knowledge in the subject. We want to have more possibilities open for researchers in other areas to potentially make use of this data. So it is kind of helpful to have an outsider's perspective to see, not that you understand, say, everything in the data set, but that you can judge what type of information is in here, what the subject matter is, and how complete this data set is. So we would be looking for things like, are there big gaps in the data sets? Do they reference having 12 files in their description, but when we download it, we're only seeing 11? Basic things like that can tell you the quality of the data set and if it's ready for publication. We're also going to be testing the download process, make sure we can download and open the files that they've provided. We'll look at the file formats to see how sustainable they are over the long term. We may make recommendations that they migrate their files or create a copy in a more sustainable format if they're using a proprietary one. Or we may just inform them, that there are some preservation concerns with the proprietary format, but that it's okay for them to go forward with it if that's what best suits the people in their field. And we provide as well some resources to the user about preservation and preservation planning. So, for example, we have file format recommendations that anybody can view before they're submitting their data sets for publication, so they can see for themselves which file formats are more sustainable than others. And then often if folks are using a proprietary format, I'll also try to find out if there's a way that the user can read that file without purchasing software. So is there an open source viewer available? And if so, can we provide a link to it in the description? Is there another format we can also provide files in? Like, can we provide PDF formats that allow people to at least see some of the data if they don't have a proprietary software program to open the raw data files and manipulate them? And then in looking at the data files themselves, like this one that we just uploaded, I would be looking for things like, do we have consistent labels in a data table like this, for example? Do we have gaps in our data set? These are often things I would circle back to the author and check in with them about to make sure that these gaps are intentional, and there may be a better way to indicate that. Maybe we can put NA or a dash or a 0 here if that's appropriate, just to show the user that we don't intend there to be data in this section. It's not missing. And I intentionally chose this data set because it is both very well described. It has very clear descriptions of all of the different fields in this data table, and it also has some things that I would go back and talk to the author about, like, is it important that the user understands why these values are highlighted? Is this column something that we need to retain even though it appears to be empty? And for issues like this that are fairly minor, they might be changes that we recommend, but don't force on the author. We want to facilitate data publication in a way that's reasonable and practical and useful and fits within their busy schedules of instruction and research. And we don't want perfection to become the enemy of good in that process. And now, so that's kind of review that I'm doing without having any subject expertise in the subject of this data set. So I would also alert our liaison librarian, who would have some insight into the nature of the research itself. And they'll often be able to take a look at data files pending publication. It's not required. So it's a little bit dependent on their availability, because again, we want to provide a kind of a rapid turnaround for our user so that they're only waiting a couple of days before their data is published. Now, our liaison librarians are usually able to provide a lot of help in the metadata describing this data set so that it's more easily findable by researchers in this field. So they can suggest especially like keywords and search terms that we can add to the description and add as tags to make it more likely that the people who want this research are going to be able to find it. If I go back to my curation page, once we've kind of talked through any issues with the data itself and made any changes that are necessary, this is what the review page looks like to approve the publication. And so a curator will go through each of these sections, the same sections that we went through as a user, and mark each one as complete. And then at the end, we will be able to either approve the publication if all of these sections are marked as complete, or if some of them need changes, we can add a note about what the change should be, and then we have the option to kick this publication back to the authors. So that basically just reverts it to a draft status so that the authors can go in and edit and make changes and then resubmit it for publication. I will say that if we use this feature to request changes and kick it back to the author, this is not going to be the first time that the author hears from us. So I would already be communicating with them about it, either over the phone or through email before I revert it back to a draft status with a request for changes. And then once I approve this publication page will become freely available to the public so that anyone can see this page and download the data itself. If we have an author put an embargo on a data set, meaning that it will be published but not publicly available until, it could be like 6 months, could be a year down the road. In that case, you would see all of this information so that the user knows that this data set exists. But instead of being able to download this bundle of data files, we would see a note about when the data files themselves will become available. And then post-publication, we provide services that help this publication get out there into the research world so that other people can find it, and we do archiving services to ensure that we can make it accessible well into the future. And so I mentioned that we keep our publications accessible on PER for at least 10 years. We can see more information about that in our policies section of the website. You're free to come read through this and see, just as an example of how we do things. We have preservation policies and file format recommendations here that are useful for people that aren't even publishing in PER, but just useful resources for data publication in general. Okay. And the last thing I want to mention too is that the PER team includes help not just from folks doing data curation, but also the digital archivist for the library helps us with our archiving and preservation. Our team includes a developer who helps with the code working behind the scenes to bundle up all of our data sets and get them ready for archiving. And then we work closely with the HUBzero team as well. It looks like I had a couple of questions that briefly popped up on my screen and then went away again. Let me see where I can.
Yep, I can ask them on the individual's behalf.
Great.
So the first one comes from Jack Smith. What parts of the pipeline demonstrated during your presentation are not available with the out-of-the-box version of HUBzero? So
I don't know. That might be a better question for you, actually.
yeah, I know. I was about to say that too. Everything that Sandy actually went over is available with the out of the box version. The only differences that you might see between her presentation and what you experience with your own hub is the fact that her has taken a lot of time to set up a lot of the configuration that makes sense for their community. So there might be some additional steps that you can add. It just takes some work from the back end. And usually if you do want to go ahead and kind of customize the publications component to fit your community, you always want to have a use case in mind. So then that way you're not going off of a blank slate. Anything that might have missed, Sandy?
No, that sounds great.
All right. So we'll move on to the next question. How does one implement the DOI assignment feature on a self-hosted site? Are there free or affordable subscription services available for small institutions?
So we partner with datasets to assign DOIs to our publications. And I know that they do provide subscription services. I don't personally know the ins and outs of that, but that's something that maybe another member of the PER team could answer offline.
Yeah, we can always have someone follow up with you after the presentation, Jack, if you're interested. So we'll move on to the last question that we have right now. Are there other metadata best practices for publications beyond the fields the publication component provides? Like, say, including a RDF JSON file with the database. Also, what standards would PER recommend for such files?
Sure. So one of the folks on the PER team is a specialist in metadata, a metadata librarian who helped us set up our metadata model and helps us stay current with best practices. So it's really important to be collaborating with other folks within the libraries to get that expertise. I know that PER employs pieces of a bunch of different metadata standards. We use premise and mods and a couple others as well. I'm not as intimately familiar with the metadata on the back end of things because I'm dealing mostly with the user experience through the web interface. But the team itself does look very carefully at metadata. And we have metadata that is going on behind the scenes in addition to the data entered by the user. And then we expose that to harvesters online to make sure that our data sets will be findable through, for example, Google Scholar. And that's also something that if anybody has specific questions, I could give you more information and follow up through an email afterwards.
We're excited that Sandy was able to present with us today, and hopefully everyone attending walk away with some know-how on data preservation and best practices when working with publications. So thank you again, Sandy, for taking the time today to talk to us, and it was a great presentation.